Guten Tag! Today I want to show you how to make the unthinkable, a super fluffy and crisp sourdough ciabatta. Normally when you make a sourdough ciabatta, you have to be very careful to not let your dough sit for too long. You might have a very sticky dough in the end. Furthermore, you have to be very careful because the sourdough might create a too strong sour note. But good news, the method that I'm going to show you is gonna make you the perfect ciabatta. And not any ciabatta, it's a naturally leavened ciabatta with your sourdough. And because that's not enough, I'm also going to be making a yeast-based version of the ciabatta at the same time, and then we can compare the difference so that you can see whether it's actually worth it or not. Plus, there's going to be a secret bonus ciabatta waiting for you at the end of the video. I'm not sure if anyone ever dared to make something like that. Unfortunately, there is one problem, and that problem is me. My taste buds and nose are not so good, so we will have a bonus external evaluator. And that external evaluator is going to tell us whether the yeast-based version or the sourdough-based version is better. So let's have some fun. Also, thank you, because I asked all of you to vote on which recipe you would like to see next, and you voted on the sourdough ciabatta. So thanks again for participating. The channel wouldn't be the same without you. Let's now have a look at the process, the full process from start to finish for the sourdough version and the yeast-based version. So from start to finish, it's gonna take around 11 to 12 hours for both the sourdough and the yeast-based version. For the sourdough version, we have to create a stiff sourdough starter first. We don't have to do this for the yeast-based version. Then we're doing something which is called autolyse. We are doing this for both options. This is just mixing flour and water in advance, and it's going to create you so much better dough. Then step 3, we are going to be adding our starter and the salt. For the yeast-based version, this is where we add the yeast and of course also the salt. Then we just have to mix everything together. We have to knead it. This is also known as creating dough strength. Afterwards, we wait until the dough roughly doubles in size. For that, I'm extracting a small piece of the dough. Once that is done, our dough has nicely fermented. And then all we have to do is we have to shape our dough. Don't be scared of shaping, because shaping a ciabatta is actually quite easy. I'll show you a nice and easy way to do exactly that. Then we're gonna let our ciabatta sit for the final proof, and then we bake it around 11 to 12 hours in. You don't need a fancy oven. I'll be showing you exactly how you can use your own home oven for that. Now for the sourdough based version, we need to make a sourdough. I have a few videos on it, but this is the too long didn't watch. When you're making a sourdough, you're pretty much trying to cultivate wild yeast and bacterial strains, and that's actually quite simple. Typically it takes around 7 days, but for some people it takes around 15 days for the starter to be fully mature. So what you do on day 1 is you mix 50 grams of whole wheat flour with 50 grams of water. You just stir everything together, and by doing so, the wild yeast and the bacteria that was on your flour is now going to start to reproduce. It has a nice environment because we also added water in there. The flour is pretty much the fuel for your microorganisms. And over time they are going to deplete the fuel. And that's why on day 2, we're taking a tiny bit of that mixture and we're mixing that again with 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water. We stir everything again. Now on day 3, your starter might already be doubling in size, but you probably haven't fully cultivated the important bacteria and yeast yet. So on day 4, it might not be doubling in size again. But don't give up, just keep doing that. And as I said before, after around day 7 or maybe day 15, you should have a sourdough starter that doubles in size after a feeding at room temperature in something around 5 to 10 hours. Then you know your starter is ready. But for this recipe, we need to have a stiff starter, and the basis for the stiff starter is your regular starter. The stiff starter has a much more mild aroma and also focuses the yeast part of your sourdough a lot more. So you have more leavening, not too much of a strong taste. And to make your stiff starter, all you have to do is take 10 grams of your regular starter, feed it with another 50 grams of flour and another 25 grams of water. That's a 50% hydration. So it's a very, very dense starter actually. Repeat this for around 2 to 4 days. Take 10 grams of your previous day, mix that with 50 grams of flour and 25 grams of water. And please use your nose. You will sense that your starter is much more mild. So now that you have everything, let's talk about the ingredients. For the ingredients, I plan to make around 2 ciabattas each. That's 200 grams of flour per ciabatta that you want to make. The flour that I've been using was a bread flour. You want to have a flour that's not too high in protein content, check the packaging, and not too low. So in this case, I've been using Caputo flour. It had around 12% protein. For water, I used around 320 grams of room temperature water. That's around 80% in terms of baker's math. 80% of 400 is around 320. This way you calculate the percentages. This makes it easy in case you wanted to bake 100 ciabattas. If you had the space, for instance, you would just need to recalculate the percentages. For the sourdough version, I used around 20% starter, that's 80 grams. For the yeast-based version, the yeast amount was very, very low. That was just 1%, 0.4 grams. It's very important that you go low in terms of yeast because you want the process to take some time. This helps you with making a better dough. Dough is going to be much better in terms of qualities and then in terms of taste. This really is the secret for making a perfect yeast-based dough. Do it slowly. Now I was using dry yeast, but you could also be replacing that with fresh yeast. In that case, you would need to use 3 times the quantity for fresh yeast. And lastly, the salt, that's 8 grams of salt for both options. That's the European Union's recommendation for salt levels in bread. 2% in terms of baker's math. I'm going to be making around 4 ciabattas. That's 200 grams of flour per ciabatta. So in total, I am using 800 grams of flour. Since we want to make a very extensible dough, using around 80% hydration, that's for 800 grams of flour, 640 grams of water. Oops, actually added a few more grams, but it's okay. The autolysis that's now about to start is going to help us to make the dough more extensible. And the autolysis, I think it's one of the most underrated tricks there is. We just stir flour and water and let that sit for some time. And this is going to make you a much softer gluten network. It's going to create you some dough strength, which means you have to knead less in the end. This makes your bread so much better. It also starts to break down the starch. You'll have more sugars, so your fermentation is faster. There are just so many advantages. And since I'm going to be making 1 yeast option and 1 sourdough option today, I think this is really one thing that you have to employ. Employ? Yes. So just mixing it like this, your hands are gonna get a little bit messy, but that's totally okay. And now I'm going to be letting this sit for around 2 hours here at room temperature. Wow, and just check out the consistency already here that I have with this flour. I've not baked with this flour before, but this feels very good. I mean, it's still tearing, but it's, yeah, it's not tearing too much, you see? But it's gonna be so much better after the autolysis. All right, so I'm just gonna cover this. Don't want this to dry out. And then I also have my sourdough starter here next to me. That's just the starter. So I'm gonna let this sit for 2 hours, then we will be back. German mode activated. You know, we Germans, we don't like anything that goes to waste. Hello again, 2 hours later. And please, just check this out. We built this amazing gluten network just by waiting. So I'm gonna be dividing this into 2 chunks now, and then I will be kneading everything. I'm gonna be using my stand mixer to knead, but you could totally also do everything by hand. There are really no tools required. It's just that I'm feeling a little bit lazy today, lazy German, you know, and that's why I'll be kneading it in the machine. But if you don't have a stand mixer, no worries. I got 5 great tips to create incredible dough strength. Please check out that video. That's exactly what you want to do. In the stand mixer, I'm going to be using around medium speed until I see that the dough lets go of the bowl. So let's get started with the sourdough based one. Now, let's add the salt. That's 8 grams of salt. And then I'm using around 20% sourdough starter since I used 800 grams of flour. And this is just half the dough. That's gonna be 80 grams of sourdough starter. Oh, look Look at this nice gluten network here. That looks so good. Oh, and the aroma this one has. It really has such a nice, amazing... Check this out. Oh, gluten. This really has such an amazing aroma. Okay, and now it's time to knead this. Let's prepare the next dough. That's the yeast-based one. I used again 8 grams of salt, and now I'm using 0.1% based on the flour in terms of dry yeast. So for that I had to use my precision scale. It's a very, 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 very small amount. So you don't have to be so super precise, but lesson learned is when you want to make great, amazing bread with yeast, use a very, very little amount to slow down the whole process. The more yeast you know, the faster things are. But the chemical reactions that are happening inside of your dough just can't keep up with the speed of the yeast. You want your flour to break down a little bit since you now added water. And yeah, with too much yeast, that's just gonna be too fast. I think this is the biggest mistake people do when they make yeast-based doughs. So you wanna have a slow fermentation. Now I'm using dry yeast, but you could also be using fresh yeast. It's the same microorganism. In that case, you would need to triple the amount. So for 1 part of dry yeast, you use 3 parts of fresh yeast. That's it pretty much. So same thing again, I'm gonna be kneading this and then we'll be checking back on the 2 doughs. Oh, and this aroma coming over here from the sourdough, I love it. Lesson learned the hard way while working on the bonus ciabatta that you will see at the end of the video. I learned the hard way that you shouldn't start mixing on high speed. Anyways, so sneak preview of what we're making. I'm gonna be showing you this magic thing at the end of the video. Both of the doughs have been kneaded, yeast and sourdough. And please check this out. This is exactly what you want. See how much of a gluten network I have? This is done by kneading. You're aligning your gluten. And now this is going to be trapping all that gas created by the fermentation. Same here, the yeast-based dough has such a great gluten network as well. It's just so much fun to play with those doughs. And this is at around 80% hydration. And by creating all that dough strength, the dough is also so much less sticky. So this is exactly what you want. I could be playing with those doughs the whole day because they're extensible, so I can stretch them. But at the same time, they're also not too extensible. And I think that's really where the autolysis that we did came nicely into play. Okay, time to be extracting 2 fermentation samples that we will use to monitor how the fermentation is going. The fermentation now starts since we had the yeast and the sourdough. And by using a small jar, you can use any other jar that you have. We will know exactly when the fermentation is completed. And this is also why kneading is important, because you want to make sure that this fermentation sample has the same amount of microorganisms as your dough, well, at least the partial parts of it. And if you don't knead well, you might have more sourdough in this place, more yeast in this place, and so on. That's why homogenizing everything is so crucial and important. I'm gonna be rounding them up now, just with my bare hands over the surface like that. And then they're gonna start fermenting. Sweet. 2 perfect doughs. Both of the doughs have increased around 50% in size, so let's give them a nice stretch and fold. With wetted hands, I'm carefully removing the dough from the edges of the container. Then go below the dough with your hands, lift it upwards and fold it over. Repeat. Rotate the bowl, lift upwards, fold over, and that's our dough. One more time with the yeast-based dough. With wetted hands again, remove the dough from the edges of the container. There we go. So our dough is ready, and we start by preparing a tray and by placing a parchment paper on top and a little bit of flour. Sprinkle some flour on top. This is our dough, and we are going to flour it a bit as it's relatively sticky. We will remove the dough a little bit from the edges of the container. This works because I floured my hands. And then with floured hands, I'm taking the dough out and I'm placing it on the surface here. The dough is completely filled with gas, and every move that we are doing is going to degas the dough a little bit. So we have to be very careful. I'm just elongating the dough a tiny little bit, and this is gonna be 2 ciabattas. And to cut the ciabattas, I'm just using my dough scraper. I'm going to be cutting this in the middle. If you had more ciabattas, you would need to cut several pieces from your dough. Then afterwards, I'm gonna be placing this on the tray. This is now the sourdough version. The yeast version is not ready yet. So with a swift movement, cut down. You don't want to degas the dough, very important. Those are pretty much our 2 ciabattas from the sourdough version. I'm just going to be sprinkling them with a little bit of additional flour, and then I'm just tugging a little bit of flour below so that they won't stick to the surface anymore. Carefully with my hands, I'm adjusting the shape, how they look like. I'm trying to not degas them. So there's not any shaping. This is all the shaping we do. With a normal sourdough bread, we would be doing a lot more shaping. But those are our perfect 2 little ciabattas right there. The hardest part is now going to be to lift them with floured hands and to place them on the tray. If they stick a little bit, just tuck some more flour below. And now with 2 hands, I'm taking it and I'm placing the dough on the tray. If it's stuck a little bit, tuck some additional flour below. And those are my ciabattas. If they're not so nice in shape, I can just correct this a little bit here on the tray. But we want to be careful because every additional move is going to degas our dough a little bit. So they're now here, and we degas them a little bit during the shaping process, and we want them to inflate just a little bit more. So we're going to be using the finger poke test. We will be poking the dough, and when we see that the dent that we are inducing by poking it slightly doesn't recover so quickly, then our dough is ready to be baked. I'm going to be covering this with a kitchen towel so that this doesn't dry out too much. I'll be repeating exactly the same thing one more time with the yeast version in a little bit, I guess around another 30 minutes or so, then the yeast version is also ready. So let me put this to the side and then let's have a look again at the yeast version. One more time, the same thing with the yeast dough. I don't have an additional tray, so I'll just be placing this on a parchment paper for now, and then I'll just move this to the side here in my kitchen. I don't know really, but this seems to be much smaller than the other dough, than the sourdough. Maybe I just didn't split it carefully enough. Also here, when lifting the dough out, I kind of failed a little bit. If you saw that, then the dough didn't stay so nice in its shape. Yeah, the dough was quite extensible, so I had to tweak this a little bit here. And by the way, as you can see, I can just easily fix the dough a little bit while it's lying here. So if you want to change the shape of your ciabatta, then now is a good time to do that. So time to let them proof as well, and then we are going to be baking them. See you soon. So I got quite a ciabatta proofing situation going on. The yeast ones, the bonus ones, which I will be showing you in the end, and the sourdough ones. The sourdough ones are almost ready. I'm gonna start preheating the oven now. So with the finger poke test, you can see how I'm poking them, and the dent is still visible around 1 minute later. That's a sign that they are ready to be baked. This really is the most reliable way. What you could also do is you could move them to the fridge overnight and then just bake them a day later in case timing doesn't allow you to bake right away. That would also be work, but you have to be very careful when moving them because you don't want to be degassing them now. I'm using a stone to bake them, and here I have another bowl below. This bowl should be able to handle water. It shouldn't be a glass bowl. This bowl shouldn't crack the moment you add water to it. So be careful a little bit with this. An iron bowl would also work in that case because this is gonna heat up and then we'll be pouring boiling water inside. So be careful to not shatter your bowl, please. I'm using a stone. If you don't have a stone, you could also just bake it on a tray, but then they won't have such a nice crust from the bottom. So stone is going to preheat for 30 minutes at max temperature. My oven can do this around 270 degrees Celsius. And then let's bake them. So I find loading the ciabattas is sometimes the hardest part. What you could do is you could use a pizza peel, or in this case, I'm just gonna be sliding them from my tray. That works nicely because they're currently on parchment paper. That's the big advantage of using parchment paper here. And one more time, our ciabattas, they really have nicely inflated. And I'm so excited to see how they will turn out. Just like that, and now into the oven. Now the trick here really is the additional tray on top, which makes sure that your ciabattas bake with indirect heat at the start. This means that the crust forms a little bit later. For the test, first 10 minutes you'll have expansion, but for that you also need to have a little bit of steam. So let's add our steam now as well. I'll be baking them with upper bottom heat at 230 degrees Celsius for at least 10 minutes, and then I'll be removing the source of steam. Look at this, 10 minutes passed and they have exploded in the oven. I'm going to be baking them for another 10 minutes now without the top tray, and all the water evaporated. This is gonna give them a super nice and amazing crust. And voila, here are our beautiful looking ciabattas. Left hand side sourdough, right hand side yeast. Yeast didn't as much increase in size as the sourdough one, but that could have been simply me. Maybe I didn't ferment this long enough, or I didn't need this for exactly the same amount of time, or it could have been me during the shaping process as well. There can be many variables. What I like though here, this one looks a little bit more rustic with a little bit more flour here on top. I like the look of this ciabatta a little bit more than this one. This looks a little bit, boring. So when placing it on your tray, sprinkle it a little bit with flour. I kind of like the look of this. And now the next thing we're going to do is we are going to be slicing them open and checking whether the crumb can actually deliver or not. I'm so excited. Unfortunately, it's already a little bit late here, so I'm gonna be doing that tomorrow morning. And they already start to get a little bit wrinkly. I hope they don't get much more wrinkly. And the slight background noise is that I'm still baking that bonus bread that you will be seeing in a little bit as well. So I'm gonna go to bed and then I'll be back tomorrow and I'll be showing you everything, including that special bonus bread. See you soon. Guten Morgen, time to finally slice them open. And I present to you the bonus ciabatta. What did I do differently? This is 100% whole wheat version. I'm gonna show you the recipe at the end of the video. But let's slice them open and compare them. Whole wheat with sourdough, sourdough and yeast. Let's start with the sourdough one. Beautiful crumb. And our yeast one. Also looking beautiful. And now the whole wheat version.
slightly wild crumb here, but looking great as well. So fluffy. One more time, all of them next to each other. Whole wheat, regular sourdough, white flour, and here the yeast-based one. Let's try them and see if we can taste the difference. I'm gonna start with the yeast-based one. Great taste, but also not too much into any direction. Very balanced taste. I think what I should be doing is I should be heating them one more time in the oven to get back that crust, so that that's a little bit better. Because yeah, they have been staying here at room temperature and then they just lose the crust overnight. Okay, sourdough version. It's really not too much different from this, but here you notice a really slight tang in the end. Very wholesome taste experience. And now the whole wheat version. Would you believe me that this is whole wheat? Just look at this structure here. Wow, this is a really intense experience. I wouldn't know if this is the right one for ciabatta because it really has such a strong taste from the flour, but still it's very delicious. I can really imagine making a nice sandwich out of this. And just one more interesting thing, because I'm now preparing the picture that I wanted to take. So I sliced up a few more pieces and just compare. This was the first piece of the crumb. And this was actually cut exactly from the same ciabatta. And look at how much more wild this is. This is the yeast-based version. Just a different piece, not as wild. And same for the sourdough version. So this was the piece that I cut initially to show you. And from the same area, from the same bread, another different area, much more wild. What I think is really awesome about the ciabatta is that without too much handling, you can make an amazing bread. And the trick here really was the long fermentation with the very extensible dough, plus not touching it too much.
Now I think that both options actually tasted great, but me personally, I couldn't notice that much of a difference. And I think that's actually mission accomplished, because you don't want to have such a strong taste in your ciabatta. You want it to be rather neutral. You want the dish that you eat together with your ciabatta to shine. The ciabatta is typically just a nice side, but maybe I'm just a bad tester after all. Maybe my nose isn't good enough. So let's now show this to our external tester. Carlotta, she's my parents' doggo. She's a Bernese mountain dog and she really loves a good sourdough bread. Fun fact, by the way, did you know that in comparison to wolves, dogs are able to digest gluten? Pretty awesome, right? Let's test this. So Carlotta instantly went for the sourdough-based version on the right and thereafter quickly inhaled and completely destroyed the yeast-based version of the bread. Pretty much exactly what I did off camera, and also shows that she actually liked both of them equally as much. So I think that's a win for the recipe again. And then at the start I also promised you another bonus version. And you've seen it already, the whole wheat version. Let's talk about how we can make a whole wheat sourdough ciabatta. The whole wheat version is actually quite simple. The hardest part is probably to find a good whole wheat flour. You want to have a whole wheat flour that's also quite high in terms of protein content. So that's a strong whole wheat flour. The flours, at least where I live in Germany, are typically not as strong. I'll be linking my flours in the description as well. So the only difference in terms of the recipe is that you don't do an autolysis for the whole wheat version. That's because the whole wheat flour contains a lot more enzymes and everything is faster. Other than that, it's exactly the same thing as with the regular sourdough option. So quite simple. Hope you enjoyed the recipe. Which recipe should I be working on next? Please drop a comment in the comment section. Let me end this by saying, may the gluten be with you.